right. With our little midterm madness or midterms road to nowhere, whatever we decided to call it.
That's right.
We have Kyle Kondik rejoining the show. He, of course, is the great managing editor over at Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball at UVA Center for Politics. No relation, although I did attend school. Great to see you, Kyle, as always.
Good to see you, man.
Good to be with you guys.
Okay, so we have some new numbers from CBS News and YouGov that we can put up on the screen here. They have done their big battleground tracker poll. They find the Republicans, in terms of the race for the House, having a lead of about 25 seats in that U.S. House race. Their estimate as of today is that Republicans would end up with about 230 seats. Democrats would end up with about 205. Does that comport with roughly how you all are seeing the election at this point?
It's our best guess right now is Republican gain is somewhere in the 20s. That's a little bit higher than that CBS News estimate, but it's pretty similar. And so, one thing you got to remember is that, the Republicans are already starting with 213 seats they won in 2020. And so expecting them to replicate 1994 or 2010, they picked up, I think it was 54 in 94 and 64 in 2010. Expecting them to do that is unrealistic given the high point they're starting with. I think both of those elections, they only went in with a little less than 180 seats in both of those elections. So, I obviously, look, any House majority is a good House majority. Now, I think sometimes corralling your members, I think particularly on the Republican side, they've had some trouble with that in the past. So, the bigger it is, obviously, the easier it is to govern or to pass what you want. And I do think there's still more upside potential for Republicans in the House. But that CBS News, YouGov estimate seems, relatively reasonable to me and is pretty similar to what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and so Kyle, what are the structural, underlying factors that belie an estimate like that? So how do you factor in both the overall polling environment, generic ballots, also the polling misses that we saw in the past? What's your general thesis on forecasting this stuff?
Look, the generic ballot, I think it sometimes underestimates Republicans, particularly at this point in the cycle. If we look back 8 years ago today, roughly, the Democrats, I think, actually had a narrow lead on the generic ballot and the Rookler Politics average. It was very close. And of course, that's an election where Republicans won 247 House seats, which was their biggest House majority since the Great Depression. And there are other instances. 2020, the House generic ballot underestimated Republicans too. And that underestimated them basically the whole way through. The Democratic lead was something like 6, 7, 8 points in averages. And Democrats won the national House popular vote by only 3 and ended up losing about a dozen seats in that election. And so sometimes, for whatever reason, the generic ballot seems to pick up on Democratic leads that are real, like that they will pick up on them early. But the Republican leads sometimes break late. 2016 is another example of that, where Republicans narrowly won the House popular vote, but the generic ballot didn't really reflect that until right at the end. So I'm waiting to see, after Labor Day, a lot of these polls are going to switch to their likely voter models. A lot of the polls now are just registered voters. And so it's not necessarily trying to, figure out precisely what the electorate is. And you got to remember these surveys, I still think they do a pretty good job, but you can't expect them to be perfect. So that's a part of it too. There's a lot of science here, but there's a lot of art too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I actually want to stay on this topic because after 2016, there was a real sort of pollster reckoning, and there was a theory of why the polls missed some of what was going on. It was like, we weren't looking at, the class divide, and we weren't factoring in enough people who just had a high school education. So we fixed that, and we're going forward. We've got it this time. And then 2020 was, if anything, an even bigger miss. Has there been any figuring out of what went wrong and why polls seem to consistently underestimate the performance of Republicans in particular?
The American Association of Public Opinion Research did this. They sometimes will do this, or they often do this post-mortem of the polls, after elections. And the report in 2016 did suggest, as you mentioned, suggest some fixes. And then I think a lot of pollsters did those fixes, and there were still some problems. I guess I personally think that there is some sort of subset of people who are likely to vote Republican who are harder to capture in polls for whatever reason. There's some indication that some of these folks have basically pretty low levels of social trust, and so it's just hard for them. It's hard to get them to, or members of that group, to sort of pick up the phone or to respond to an online poll or whatnot. And so I think that there's still, again, a lot of challenges with the with the surveys. And I think it's also easy, like I said before, it's easy to sort of like dump on the pollsters, but I don't think we ought to do that. Again, I still think they do a decent job. And for someone like me who is in large part kind of reliant on the survey work that other people pay for, I find it to be kind of poor form to just be sort of, dumping on them all the time, which I try not to do, even though I think there are reasonable critiques you can make of certain polls. And as I sort of interpret the landscape, I try to take it with a grain of salt. Like, you could make an argument that the Democrats have in fact gained ground since the Dobbs decision in late June. Yep. And it does show up in the generic ballot a little bit. The Senate polling is not bad at all, really, for Democrats, given that, the people don't feel bad about the economy and Joe Biden's approvals in the 30s. But I'm just being a little cautious about it because I don't necessarily know if the environment has dramatically changed. And just in talking to people, who are involved in campaigns on both sides here, I don't necessarily know if they're seeing that either, although I think Democrats are pointing to a few, hopeful signs here and there. I think it's a little too early to say, though, that the basic structure of this election has changed, though.
Yeah, I think that is the best way in order to put the framework. So, okay, we've got, 99 days, I think, to go till this thing happens. In that period, what should we look for that are going to be the most important in shaping the election? Should it be the economic indicators, Joe Biden's overall approval rating? What are you going to look at which could adjust your overall forecast?
Typically, if people's perceptions of the economy are basically baked at this point, and that's why second quarter GDP is sometimes used as a factor in like forecasting models. This is more for like presidential races, and obviously second quarter GDP reflects a time that is a couple of months in the past now, because that's April, May, and June. And I also think that the sort of inflation and gas price indicators, like, I don't know, I just feel like even if there are big changes in sort of the facts on the ground, that people's opinions on that are again sort of baked. So I'm sort of looking at sort of enthusiasm measures, I think, with Democrats, and to sort of see if they, in fact, are enthusiastic to vote. I think the Senate, I think it's easier for Senate gubernatorial candidates to kind of, I think what Democrats are trying to do is to point to the sort of extremism and inexperience of a lot of the Republican nominees this year. And they've got a lot of fodder to work with. We'll see if that actually is works. And I typically think that like candidate debates generally don't matter much at all, like gubernatorial or Senate debates in the fall or whatever. But I'm really curious to see how the abortion issue comes up in debates, because if you remember back in 2012 when Richard Murdoch kicked away the Indiana Senate race against Joe Donnelly that year, Murdoch made these kind of idiotic comments about abortion, and it's not easy. It's not hard for me to imagine there being some big headlines that come out of debates because of kind of callous answers about abortion. And so that's something I think Democrats are hoping for too. For Republicans, I think a lot of their playbook here is pretty clear. Like, Biden's unpopular, people are upset about the economy, tie the Democrats to Biden, nationalize the election that way. That's to me the more proven electoral path. But the Democrats have some things they can do too.
Yep. Yeah, so how much do you think that candidate quality matters? Because, I'm thinking about Herschel Walker in a debate. He has struggled even in friendly interviews. He's said things that were basically every facet of his bio. He's said things that were just blatant lies about. He had all these kids that he wasn't admitting to. And meanwhile, he's out there saying like, oh, you have to be a father in their kids' lives and all this stuff. So Republicans have, partly with Trump's backing, nominated some very poor candidates and very extreme candidates in key swing states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and elsewhere. How much do you think that does ultimately matter, or is it just sort of the national wins at this point?
Look, I think it could matter a lot. And frankly, Herschel Walker is one of the candidates I was thinking about in terms of debates. And there's actually been this back and forth between Raphael Warnock, Democratic incumbent there, and Walker about whether they're going to have debates or not. And I don't know at this point if anything is actually scheduled. And I can sort of understand it, particularly from Walker's side, if they maybe didn't want to put their candidate in that sort of position. But I also think about, like, if you think back to 2014 when the Republicans last, flipped the Senate from Democratic control, and they ended up picking up 9 seats that year. A lot of them were sort of like states that were Republican that really had no business electing Democratic senators these days, like Arkansas and Louisiana. Mm-hmm. But you look at the candidates that the Republicans had that year, it was like former governors or sitting members of the House, or it was like, state level officials, that sort of thing. A lot of the candidates this year don't really have any political experience at all. You mentioned Herschel Walker, Mehmet Oz, the TV doctor in Pennsylvania. The two likeliest nominees are probably Blake Masters in Arizona. That primary's tomorrow. J.D. Vance in Ohio. Like, I could go on here, but it really is reflective of a party that is really elevating a lot of people who don't have political experience. And sometimes, being an outsider, not having a voting record, that can be good. But also sometimes those candidates end up making more mistakes because they just haven't been through it before.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Anyway, these are all the things we'll be watching because we trust Kyle over here on Breaking Points. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. We really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Kyle.
Always enjoy it.
Absolutely, man. Thank you guys so much for watching. Appreciate it as always. Go ahead and buy those tickets to the live show. Thank you to all the premium members who we've ended the promotion, but over the last month who upgraded to the yearly. It has helped us out tremendously. We're making big plans with that money. So thank you all very much. There's a link down there in the description if you're able to help us out. Become a premium member today. Otherwise, we will see you all tomorrow.
See y'all tomorrow. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.